So let's start with a message from a newscaster. Why not? Because we love newscasters getting in touch. Connor has written to us. Hi, newscasters. Another Workington man here. Just wanted to say I hated this label in the 2019 election. Workington man, of course, was the label to put on a cliched group of voters who were supposedly those what won it for Boris Johnson, based on the fine town of Cumbria in the north of England. Connor has a sidebar. Could you explain how this general election will affect Scotland? Some polls have Labour ahead of the SNP. If Labour wins a majority of Scottish Westminster seats, could we see a Labour First Minister? Or would that be decided in a Scottish election? P.S., and I love this bit, I avoided using tartan wall purely for Laura's benefit. So, Handy, we got you here this week, hey?
Yes, good morning to you, Laura. Tartan wall, yeah, I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of tartan wall either. And we will answer that question, Connor. We will answer it, but you have to keep listening.
And a few other things to go through today.
Sure, yeah. We have the various commitments made that seem to be fairly new commitments from on welfare reform. And we also have the previews for the manifestos.
It's going to be an exciting episode of this Sunday's Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
It's Faisal in the studio too.
It's James in Glasgow.
Hooray! How nice to have the two of you with me here on a Sunday afternoon, having been abandoned by Paddy and Henry and Adam and everybody else.
I fought my way through thickets of pollen. Apparently it's all male trees that try and mate with you.
What?
Someone planted only male plane trees, and this is why pollen is horrific at this time.
Is that true? I've wondered for years, because I used to, working in Westminster, used to get absolutely clobbered and like crying on the news, not because of the stories, but because of the pollen.
Well, maybe a little bit of that.
Maybe
as well.
a little bit of that.
But that's what it is, and it's all down. Apparently, the Australians got rid of it. I looked at this a lot because, anyway. If I sneeze, that is why.
Treecast coming soon. So, let's start with today's news then, because it's a sort of busy election morning, not with one big gigantic story, but lots of different things coming out. The Tories were talking about more changes to the benefit system that they want to do, extra cash for some mental health talking therapies. Labour are talking about more prison places, and the difference between them and the Conservatives on that is that they would give a Justice Secretary the power just to build a prison in a community rather than having to go through the planning system where they, shock horror, get stuck. And the Lib Dem manifesto is coming tomorrow, and they've been talking today about trying to tackle ambulance delays by improving social care, which, as we've talked about so many times, prominent politicians have fudged the solution for caring for our elderly and vulnerable for so long. And Labour, lastly, has had an attack from the SNP saying they can't implement the cuts that number crunchers spell out they'd have to have. It would be more austerity. Where's the money going to come from? So, Faisal, the common theme across all of those things is the cash. And when you look at this and where things are going in this election, what are the big questions in terms of how their sums add up or don't?
A lot of the numbers that have been bandied about up until this point is pure fiscal shadow boxing, right? They don't have the numbers. We're going to get the manifestos. We're going to get, I think, costing documents, or at least some part of those manifestos showing they, quote unquote, all add up. Everything up until this point has been essentially an accusation from one side to the other about how on some other set of assumptions they might not add up. And, and we've seen, again, the Conservatives have doubled down on their £2,000 Labour tax rise claim. Obviously, they'll be delighted I've just mentioned that again. But that's, they want to carry on saying that. I think the big news for me, you have to reverse engineer this announcement. And we'll get into the detail on welfare. We'll get into the detail on the actual welfare announcement. Perfectly plausible that you might think that you can save money on a bill that's kind of going up. I think we could even say ballooning since the pandemic. There are reasons for that. But why have they announced 12 billion of savings today, this weekend, on Sunday, with the manifesto coming out on Tuesday? To my mind, that creates, it's manifesto accounting, I would call it that. It creates a pot, quote unquote, that you can spend, quote unquote, on some sort of manifesto offer. So we had some briefing on Friday about the shape of some of the tax cuts. It looks rather modest, I think it's fair to say, in terms of was there a big bazooka there that could change the game? you start to think, right, they're going to spend the 12 billion on something. It brings back into play maybe inheritance tax or some big national insurance move. That's why you would do this, I think. And we'll get into this later. The 12 billion has been severely questioned by the IFS and others. But I think that's the direction of travel as a result of the announcements that we've got this weekend. So
there could be a promised inheritance tax cut in the Tory manifesto, and we know that Conservative activists theoretically should lap that up. Whether it would have a difference on voters at this stage in the game, James, I don't know.
No, and well, that's a good question, because you talked a lot this morning about the undecided voter, didn't you, Laura? About and it's interesting to ponder how many of those there might be, or how many people after 14 years of Conservative rule might have perhaps made up their mind about whether they like what they see or they don't like what they see. I wonder if, and I think this was reflected in some of the chat you had in the panel as well, whether some people are still waiting, voters I mean, to see precisely what Labour is going to spell out on this in the manifesto, because there's been so much talk about change, hasn't there? And then the question that keeps rebounding on Keir Starmer is, what precisely does that change look like? And that's what the SNP are trying to tap into here by suggesting, in their view, that there isn't a great deal of substance around that change, and therefore their argument is, well, as we heard Stephen Flynn making this morning, look, if you want substantive change, significant change, and you want a party that will hold both Labour and the Tories to account on delivering substantive change, then you need to vote for someone else. Now, you can get into a whole load of detail, debate about whether that's a credible position and whether the SNP or any other party will deliver change. But I wonder if it doesn't all come back to the same thing, which is, are our politicians, all of them, being honest about the state of the economy, about how well we're growing or otherwise, about productivity in this country, and about the direction of travel, and therefore about how much money they have available to spend?
And I think a lot of people would say the pretty clear answer to that is no. And John Caldwell, the billionaire who founded and made lots of money from Phones for You, was on our panel this morning. And really interesting, he gave lots of money to Boris Johnson. He's basically now takes a very dim view of Rishi Sunak. He has had entreaties from Labour trying to get him on side. He's not convinced by Labour. And he says to me this morning, like, he's lost. He's like a lost voter, and he doesn't think any of them are being radical or credible, really, on the economy. And particularly, he's very interested in green investment and climate change. And he thinks basically they're all missing a big opportunity. But the don't knows are still there, right? They absolutely are still there. And when you talk to both parties, both the big parties and the SNP and the Lib Dems and the Greens, when you talk to all the parties, they'll all tell you that don't knows are still there in a surprising proportion at this election. Shall we have a listen, though, to how Mel Stride tried to say that they'd be able to pay for some of the very many policies that they have announced already?
Compare our record. There's something called the tax gap, which is the difference in what we should be bringing in through tax and what we actually do.
And you did lots of work on it at the Treasury.
But the point is, judge us by our track record. So under Labour in 25-26, that figure was up around 7+%. Under ourselves, it was down at about 4-point-something%. So the evidence is we are much better at doing this. Now, you're right. Labour are saying they'll get
14 years.
Labour are saying they'll get 5 billion, so we're saying 6. So we're in a similar ballpark. But we have the track record to deliver. And all of those measures that you've just shown there, Laura, most of them are covered by that 6+ billion in 2029.
But if you're so great at cracking down on tax avoidance and getting money back for hard-working people, why haven't you done it already?
Well, we have been doing it, and there's more that we can do.
Well, I just want to put on the record, politicians nearly always say they can get more money back from tax avoidance, and they don't nearly always manage to get as much back as they want. So just to put that on the record. Absolutely. And apparently our fact checkers found that tax avoidance had already been coming down under Labour, and basically what's happened is the graph going down has continued under the Conservatives, but there isn't a big contrast, particularly, which he was trying to claim there. So interesting. But Faisal, tell us about this 12 billion then, because I think that is really interesting and maybe a big pointer to some quite big news on Tuesday. So
the 6 billion that you rightly asked about is the tax avoidance, and that helps fund most of the giveaways from National Service to the triple lock plus that we've had so far. So the 12 billion, as I was saying a moment ago, opens up some extra space for something ahead of the manifesto. Is the 12 billion fair? Well, it comes essentially from savings on welfare spending. That was pre-pandemic £49 billion per year. It is now 69 billion, and it's heading to just below 80 billion by 28-29. So on the face of it, you are slowing the rate of growth from 49 up to 80, and there may be 12 billion. That is the problem is that many of the steps that they have detailed today are already factored into the 80 billion. And the biggest one that isn't, it seems difficult to think you'd save 12 billion from that. You might be able to save 12 billion from others. I remember there was a famous debate about 12 billion of welfare savings in the 2015 general election, and it did more or less achieve that eventually. The IFS have been hugely critical, really, straight out of the blocks, saying essentially that this is a heroic assumption, and it seems pretty unlikely that they would reach that based on what they have announced. But as I said, it's a piece of manifesto accounting that provides some space. And what's interesting is Labour's response, because you could be tempted if you're Labour to say, well, if they assume 12 billion, we can also assume 12 billion, and we'll have 12 billion to spend on something. They've just said it's been plucked out of thin air. They feel confident enough just to attack it as a piece of fancy accounting.
So what we're saying clearly today is that the Tories are saying, look, we can save 12 billion quid from making changes to the welfare system, but the independent number crunchers, the IFS, have looked at the sums and they've gone, not sure if that adds up. James, you've got your hand up. That's so polite.
Well, I just had one thing.
Like a teacher.
Just power in.
That just struck me, which is, and I'll be interested to know what you both think about this. Isn't the question before you even get to whether the numbers are credible is, are these people genuinely disabled or not? These people who are claiming this benefit? And is it not at least possible that because of the crisis in the NHS, and I've spent, unfortunately, a lot of time in hospitals and other NHS services in Glasgow in the last 6 months, and I can assure you that everyone you speak to there thinks it is in crisis, is it not possible that the skyrocketing waiting lists, which means that people are waiting longer and longer for one piece of treatment, that their condition might deteriorate, they might then be that might be exacerbated, they might have other conditions that develop as a result of that, that is at least in part what is contributing to the rise in those disability payments, and therefore you can't completely disentangle the idea of tackling the welfare system from fixing the NHS.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's one of the reasons why welfare reform has always been very, very difficult, and there's a long list of reasons why it's always been very difficult. Is one, that often you're talking about people with very, very significant needs. Secondly, you're often talking about people with significant needs connected to all sorts of different public services. It's not just, oh, well, you claim your benefit, end of story. We cut your benefit, or we make you go back to work. Often these are people with very, very complicated issues. Then, of course, there are in the system people who maybe don't need the amount of support they get. And I'm not making accusations, but there is some level of benefit fraud and people making claims that they don't, that most taxpayers would think that they don't deserve. But that also was very difficult to kind of crack down on. And what you have seen over a long period is both of the parties actually become more and more interested in what they fancily call conditionality, but in other words, making it harder for people to get taxpayers' cash. Even if they're judged to need it, there are kind of more hoops and more obstacles that you have to get over. But the bill is absolutely ginormous and is getting bigger. So it's a real challenge for all politicians, whether or not their sums on it actually add up.
So I think the Conservatives would argue they have recognised exactly what you say by putting about £500 million into talking therapies.
Yeah.
So you offer the therapy up front, so then you don't have to pay the benefit later. The bigger point, though, is that there's been a structural change in the economy post-pandemic. More people are likely to say, particularly younger people, that they have a sort of mental health condition that will prevent them from doing work and therefore need benefits. That is a change. And whoever gets into government in a month's time will have to address this in some way.
Yeah, and it's a cultural thing, maybe.
And obviously, prevention is better than cure. Everyone's going to argue that up front. But, can they actually come up practically with a solution? Well, that's the question.
And this plays into the debate here in Scotland in a particularly interesting way, Faisal, because what you have here is really, particularly in the central belt of Scotland, the old industrial central belt, and particularly Glasgow, it's a discussion about who are the genuine inheritors of the old Labour left-leaning vote in this city and other big and old industrial heartlands around it. And one of the big issues that's coming up in that debate, and you're hearing the SNP trying to hammer home, is, look, they say, that both Labour and the Conservatives take a similar approach on this issue, both in terms of their levels of public spending and in terms of their approach to welfare and trying to just control, as they would, I think, see it, Labour and the Tories, the welfare budget. And there's been a particular row about this two-child benefit cap, this idea that you can only claim benefit, universal credit or tax credits on the first two children in a family. And the SNP campaigning hard, saying that that's cruel and unfair and needs to be loosened up and expanded to other children, or back to what it was. Labour giving the sense that they want to do that, but they are just being careful with the purse strings. But that's a dividing line. As people are fighting here, particularly here in Glasgow, to see whether Labour can win back some of that support that went to the SNP last time, like which is the authentic left-leaning party.
And it's a challenge for Labour, absolutely, in terms of wrangling their left flank, right? Whether that's in Scotland, where the compass, if you like, is a little bit further to the left, maybe not as much as people would sometimes think. There's a massive difference between the Scottish vote and the English vote, but the compass is probably just a little bit further to the left. But in terms of what Labour was offering today, it's not something that's going to get people sort of going wild in the aisles necessarily. So their offer today from Shabana Mahmood was to carry on with the Tories' commitment to build 20,000 extra prison places, but to change the planning rules so that they could actually do them very quickly. And what was interesting to me as well was that the Conservatives have been letting prisoners out early because the prisons are so full. Shabana Mahmood this morning was very reluctant to spell out that Labour would probably also keep doing that if they win. She did, though, not rule it out, but she was very hesitant actually to kind of spell that out, because no politician wants to say, yeah, sure, we're letting offenders out early. But it was quite clear she thinks she might have to carry on with that. But she said they'd publish the numbers if they do and if they've won.
Part of the reason we've got overcrowding in our prisons is because the government has run out of space, because they haven't delivered the full 20,000 prison places that they said they would do by next year. It's actually not a money problem in that respect. The money has already been allocated in the Ministry of Justice budget. It's actually a failure of the government because they've allowed the planning system to get in the way, and they've allowed complaints from their members of parliament, backbenchers in particular, to stop any building in our country. So this is actually about the government having the will to get prisons built. On day one, we would designate prisons as being of national importance so that those decisions are ultimately made by ministers rather than the usual planning process.
We love to hear from newscasters, as you know. Do get in touch with us, like Lewis from Colchester, who's been in touch with this question about manifestos.
Hello, Newscast. Lewis here from Colchester. My question is, when can we expect to see each of the parties' manifestos? And what is the strategy behind the timing of this? Is it better to go early, or are parties keen to force opponents to show their hands first?
Well, I think Lewis is suggesting that there's some sort of like game of poker over whether you show your hand, like maybe fiscally. My sense is that we know that what's in the Labour manifesto is hammered down because they had their union meeting on Friday.
Yes.
So it's kind of firmly in place. So they're not going to get to react to what happens on Tuesday in the Conservative manifesto.
No.
And have you ever known anyone to sort of change the manifesto as a result of what they've heard in other manifestos?
Well, I know, no, but I know that the Tory manifesto wasn't printed as of yesterday.
Okay.
Which is a little fun fact. It's been printed today, and I get the feeling that was a much more fluid process, right? So they want the option. However, remember, they're also paranoid about this. So the Labour manifesto leaked before me and a couple of other journalists got their sticky paws on the Labour manifesto.
2017.
In 2017.
Yeah. That worked out okay in a funny way, didn't it? It sort of propelled them a little bit.
Oh, well, I think some people in the Labour Party were delighted that it was out there because they got like 4 days coverage instead of 2. But the manifestos, I don't think there's a sort of underhand plotting way of doing it, but there certainly is. The parties think very carefully every day about what the others are doing, right? They're all watching the chess pieces on the board and who's going to do what when. As far as we know, the Lib Dems are tomorrow. The SNP is much later on, isn't it, James?
Yeah, the 19th.
And the Tories are on Tuesday, we think, and Labour on Thursday. James, tell us, Stephen Flynn this morning said the SNP has not given up on independence, even though I think Friday night in the debate was one of the first times I've seen an SNP politician on stage for more than an hour and hardly ever mention independence. From looking at the campaign, rather than talking about what's in their soul, from looking at the campaign, does it look like they've given up for now?
So I think what was striking was that what we heard from Stephen Flynn in the debate, and indeed in your interview this morning, was not really necessarily the same as we're hearing from John Swinney in news conferences and campaign events in terms of independence. John Swinney has actually been mentioning independence quite a lot. And for me, Stephen Flynn has advanced in both of these big UK-wide set-piece TV occasions over the last 48 hours or so, has advanced half of the argument on the from the SNP's perspective, which is, look, Britain isn't working. He calls it broken Brexit Britain, as we were saying earlier. You know, they will say it's low growth, it's low productivity, it's high inequality. And not only that, this isn't just, in their view, a Conservative problem. Labour do not have a credible plan to be able to tackle that and fundamentally sort out the British state. But he didn't get to the next bit, which John Swinney has been getting to in the campaign, which is, and therefore, in their view, you know, number one, and Mr Flynn did say this a little bit, we need to have SNP MPs at Westminster holding the government's feet to the fire, in the words of the Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes this week. But the other bit is, and in the longer term, for Scotland to escape what they regard as this failing state, independence could be the answer. And one of the reasons why I find it slightly odd that they might not want to talk about independence is because the polling for independence is higher at the moment than the polling for the SNP. It's hovering, once you exclude don't knows and won't says, just under 50%. We can have a long debate about what that would actually look like if people were to vote tomorrow or if they were to vote at the end of a real campaign. But nonetheless, that's what the polls suggest just now. Whereas SNP support has dropped pretty sharply over the last year or so for perhaps a whole host of reasons. They've been in government for a long time. They're coming under pressure of their handling of the public services. There's been a police investigation into their finances. They've had a couple of changes of leader. I mean, you know, that's the brief list.
That's a whole, yeah, I was going to say there's a whole other. I think we've done whole other podcasts on that on other occasions. Shall we talk about Nigel Farage? Now, Nigel Farage, who's made a lot of news this week by saying he would stand after he said he wouldn't stand and sort of declaring himself the leader of Reform UK. Reform UK is the only place really where there's been much movement in the polls. They have been closing the gap between themselves and the Tories. And there is Tory panic, which we discussed yesterday, about could there be a crossover moment and actually they overtake. That hasn't happened yet. But could it or could it not? Now, one of the things we wanted to talk about with Nigel Farage this morning was what he said about Rishi Sunak missing the D-Day commemorations. Now, we've all talked about Rishi Sunak's mistake endlessly, but this morning we discussed with him what he'd said about Rishi Sunak. He said, like every other politician, including Rishi Sunak himself, said it was a terrible mistake for him to leave. But he went on to say it showed that Rishi Sunak not just wasn't a patriot, but didn't understand our history and our culture. And we wanted to know this morning, what did he mean by that and what was he trying to get at?
He should have known in his heart that it was right to be there. I was there. I've been raising money for some weeks to send veterans back to Normandy. The vast majority of people in Britain felt this commemoration was important and the last opportunity to honour the remnants that are still alive. And by the way, I know what your question's leading at. 40% of our contribution in World War I and World War II came from the Commonwealth. He is utterly disconnected by class, by privilege, from how the ordinary folk in this country feel. He revealed that, I think, spectacularly when he left Normandy early.
Now, Shabana Mahmood for Labour told us actually she thought the comments were a dog whistle. In other words, they were trying to stir up racist, they were trying to stir up anti-immigrant feeling. And
on the basis of the Prime Minister's ethnic background.
On the basis of the Prime Minister's background. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, and what she described it as a sort of classic Nigel Farage moment where he dangles something and then just steps back. And Mel Stride, who's a very close ally of Rishi Sunak, said he had found it deeply uncomfortable. He said it was very regrettable. He didn't want to sort of go full blast at Nigel Farage. But I think this may well, not necessarily these specific comments, but I think as the reform campaign proceeds, I think there is likely to be more scrutiny and more pressure on this kind of moment, right? He's claiming now to newspapers, as he did to The Express, and they put it on the front page, that he wants to be the real opposition. He is trying to obliterate the Tory party and then find a big role for himself in national politics, actually in Parliament, rather than somebody who's incredibly famous but on the sidelines. But I just wonder if this is going to attract their positions and their statements and their comments on things like this are going to start to attract more attention, because they're obviously very serious players in this general election as of today. Even though you were very slightly late, it was very lovely to spend some of Sunday morning with you. Our Newscast will be back tomorrow with Adam and Chris, and I'm sure a few other members of the gang. Faisal will be here through the week with his giant calculator as the manifestos emerge, and Abacus. I'll be here on Thursday and then Saturday and Sunday, but who knows? Who knows? Who knows what the next week will bring? But for now, let's bring this to a close, and thank you everybody for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.